The Earth's climate is changing at a pace that we've never recorded before, and the scientific evidence points to a large human influence on this change. And this change is already affecting real people. In 2024, many parts of the world saw severe flooding, heat waves, and wildfires, which contributed to a loss of life and the displacement of thousands of people. For example, a reduced global cereal harvest resulting from widespread drought contributed to millions of people facing acute food insecurity. It's clear that the changing climate is not just a scientific question, but it's also a human question. Yet despite this, progress towards meeting agreed international climate targets and mitigating the effects of climate change is, at best, very slow. Pope Francis, in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si on care for the common home, commented, "When we speak of the environment, what we really mean is a relationship existing between nature and the society which lives in it. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it." So it's this human aspect of climate change that we wish to address today. We can ask ourselves, in approaching the climate crisis, can an understanding of this relationship between human beings and their environment help us to understand the nature of this crisis and work together to build solutions? And how can an understanding of the place of humans in the natural environment help us with communicating the science and with policy development? So to discuss these issues, I'm very happy to be joined by a very distinguished panel of experts. So on my far right, I have Professor Rosalind Cornforth, who is a Professor of Climate and Development and Director of the Walker Institute at the University of Reading. So in her work, Ros collaborates with governments and NGOs in developing countries, and she has extensive high-level experience working as a technical consultant with UN agencies and governments, including the African Union, the World Bank, and the UK Department for International Development. On my immediate right, Professor Brian Hoskins, who has been a professor of meteorology in the University of Reading for 40 years. He was also founding director of the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at Imperial College London and is now its chair. Among many awards in his career, he was awarded a knighthood in 2007 for services to the environment, and in 2024, he received the prestigious Japan Prize for the establishment of a scientific foundation for understanding and predicting extreme weather events. And finally, on my left, Dr. Ben Wilson, who is Director of Public Engagement for SCIAF, the Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund, Caritas Scotland. So since 2017, Ben has led SCIAF's climate justice advocacy work at Scottish, UK and international level. And since 2021, he has advised the Vatican on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And he was a member of the Holy See delegation to the COP28 climate negotiations in Dubai. So welcome and thank you for joining us, the panel. I'd like to start really by just setting the context and asking to start with Brian, if you can just say briefly, what do we mean by a climate crisis and why do we say it's a crisis?
Okay.
A big question in 3 minutes.
Right, so just a few bits of evidence for this problem we have. So the first thing is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We know that that has risen by 50% since the Industrial Revolution, and most of that increase has happened. Well, it wasn't on. I hope you heard my voice from the first bit anyway. I'll quieten it off now. So the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen by 50%, and we know that this is due to burning of fossil fuels. The evidence is there from a number of directions. So it's our burning of fossil fuels that has led to this. Carbon dioxide, if you add it to the atmosphere, such as when you drive your car down the road, it stays there for a very long time. So 100 tons now, you'd come back in 1,000 years if you could, and there'd still be an increase of somewhere around 30 tons due to what you did. So it's a very long-term problem. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. And just putting it very simply, a greenhouse gas is transparent to the sun's radiation that comes through, but it actually absorbs the heat given off by the earth and re-radiates it where it's colder. So a greenhouse gas means the earth is warmer than it would be. In fact, we wouldn't be here without the greenhouse effect. The earth would be a frozen planet. Because of the greenhouse effect, it's been livable for us and for other environmental species. However, too much of a good thing, you add more greenhouse gas, then it's going to warm. And you can do a calculation on the back of the envelope or with a supercomputer, and it's going to warm. You double carbon dioxide, it warms somewhere around 3 degrees, plus or minus a bit. So has the temperature gone up? Well, yes, it certainly has. Again, we're confident that since the Industrial Revolution, and again, mainly since the 1970s, the temperature of the Earth has gone up by about 1.5 degrees. So the Earth has got warmer. It isn't just carbon dioxide. There are other greenhouse gases we're interfering with, principally methane, etc. But the carbon dioxide is the principal one. So the Earth has got warmer, but it's not just a question of we all just stay as we are, but get a little bit warmer, which sounds quite nice, you know. So certainly if you live in Britain, it sounds quite nice. However, going along with that, then we see a number of other things. The ice on the planet starts to melt, and also the oceans, as they get warmer, expand. And both of those lead to sea level rise, and it's already gone up something like 20 centimeters, and it's something like 4 millimeters a year, 4 centimeters per decade. Now, so it isn't just that as well. We've seen heavy rainfall events, again, for perfectly understandable scientific reasons. A warmer atmosphere can hold more water, and in general it does. So the same rainstorm, if it's 6 degrees warmer, can be 50% stronger. And we're seeing that everywhere. And we're not just seeing generally warmer, but the heat that goes with that, the heat extremes. And this has huge impact on us, on our food, the flooding events, etc. So looking forward, if we keep going as we are, then the temperature will rise by the end of the century, somewhere between 3 or 4 degrees probably. And the sea level may be 0.5 meter higher. But going with that, we actually cannot rule out that it would be 2 meters higher by the end of the century. So with our present physical understanding, sea level could be 2 meters higher, and the extreme events that we've already seen way more. Now, I'll sort of turn to, is this a crisis? I think I'll use the analogy of frogs in a pan of water on the stove. The heat is rising. Now, do those frogs have a crisis? Well, certainly if they stay in that pan, they'll die. And they're doing all right at the moment. And they probably think, well, I can cope with this. This is all right, I can cope. And then it gets a little bit warmer. They can cope, just about. But at some point, you know, they've had it. Is that a crisis? I think it probably is. So that's the climate crisis we're in.
Thank you. Very, very clear. I don't know if at this point Ros or Ben want to add in some examples of what you've seen in your work of this.
No, I'd be happy to, unless you want to go first, Ros. Yeah, sure. And as Amos said, I work for Skiaf Caritas Scotland. We work in, you know, as you can imagine, some of the poorest countries in the world. And I think often when I'm explaining the climate crisis to our supporters in Scotland and the UK, I tell the story of a woman I met in southern Malawi. I went out to visit with the BBC on a trip to cover some of the extreme weather that they'd been experiencing there back in January 2023. And I met a woman called Sophia. She was a young mother. She had 3 children. When I met her, she was sitting outside a tin hut, which had been provided, I think, by the Red Cross. She'd been living there for about 11 months with her children, and there was about 20 women in total crammed into this construction, which was probably about 4 by 8 meters. You know, a tiny, incredibly cramped space. And I spoke to Sophia as part of the work we were doing there, and she told me her story. So she'd lived in a village with everyone else we met in that village. She'd been living downriver somewhere until 2015, when the flooding, which she was experiencing, became too great, and the local authorities eventually moved the community out upriver to another location. And then in 2019, they'd been hit by cyclones Idai and cyclones Kenneth, which devastated southern Malawi and Mozambique and surrounding countries. And then in 2022, they'd been hit again by, I think it was Cyclone Anna and Gombe, and that had destroyed her house, and that's why she was then living in this temporary accommodation. Temporary. She was there for 11 months when I met her. And then we know that soon after that, southern Malawi was hit by Cyclone Freddy. And honestly, I don't know how Sophia is now and how she was affected by that. But what I really felt there was, the real human impact of this. And as Brian said, of course, southern Malawi and surrounding countries have experienced cyclones for many, many years, but never to this frequency and intensity that they're now experiencing them. And that the people like Sophia's community, who are obviously incredibly resilient people and have endured a lot of hardship and poverty over many, many years, this is becoming too great. The tide is now too great for them to continue to be resilient against. But lastly, if I may, what was really profound about that experience of meeting her, I think, was the sundering of her life and her community. So she was living in this temporary accommodation with other women, but away from her husband, because of course the men and the women were then kept separate. As I said, temporary accommodation, but she'd been there for 11 months. So it had really torn her family apart. But the village that she was living in, also because of new rainfall patterns, this new village where they'd been moved to, was separated now more and more by a seasonal river, which literally was impassable for many months of the year now. So the climate crisis was really tearing apart her family and tearing apart her village, as well as destroying her livelihood. And so for me, that's the human side, I suppose, of the science that Brian's outlined, and why this is such a human crisis as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I just reflecting on that and the climate crisis. Well, the climate crisis is made up of a sum of crises, as Ben has just been pointed to, and they are a sum of. So the climate crisis is made up of a sum of crises, as Ben has just referred to. And they're not just one-off, they are recurring crises which erode resilience and mean that people at the end of the day are unable to cope with their current livelihood strategies. So moving from Southern Africa up to East Africa, I was reminded of this very clearly. And also, I hope, coming back to the theme of the conference, of this session as well, the working with fishing communities around Lake Victoria and looking at where the current climate environmental changes are taking them and into the future. And working down in the fishing communities, assuming that they were having challenges facing with the fishing that they're doing. Lake Victoria, the changing temperature means that the fishing stock has changed. The ecosystem has changed. And there is no longer sufficient fish that they would use to support not only themselves, but also their livelihoods. But they're adapting, they're changing. Their boats are moving from one landing site to another, taking bricks from one village to another. In return, cabbages come back. And there's these actions that are being taken. But in the process of having to move to different landing sites and create these new trade routes, if you like, we're seeing reemergence of cholera, reemergence of HIV. Women are left for months on their own with no income in hand and having to turn to all sorts of different occupations. So there are these cascading impacts which happen. And it also just takes me back very quickly, Amos, I will finish, but just to say that we as scientists went in there kind of thinking about climate change and making assumptions about what we were going there to learn and to do. And to our utter surprise, people were already adapting and managing the crises that they're experiencing. And it reminds us that we must open our ears, we must listen before we start doing things. And it just reminds me of the companionship understanding where we all sit and what these crises are that people experience means that we can better serve and help and work with one another.
Thank you. And I think this idea of companionship leads on to what I would like to talk about next, is really looking at the roots of the climate problem. So, and in particular this human aspect. So beyond the scientific aspects of the problem, what do you consider to be the human roots of the climate problem and the climate crisis that we're facing? And particularly, does the idea of what we're talking about this weekend, does solitude or a conception of being alone contribute to this climate crisis? And if so, in what way? So, don't know who would like to start with that. Brian?
Well, I'll start there. I first talked about this problem, the first public lecture I gave was in the 1970s. And this was well known in international circles, political circles, by 1990. But somehow we haven't done anything about it. What we've done is just this much. And I've always thought it is a real challenge to us. We've known people look after themselves, they look after their families, and perhaps they look after their village and their wider community. But here we're struck with a problem. Can we actually think as a human being, as part of this, the whole species? And that's a real challenge to us. So that's my starter, I think. We have a challenge to think beyond ourselves, and holding us back are, let me introduce that, vested interests are making money from the present situation. There are lots of things holding us back. So we really need to think together as a human species. Can we move forward and actually do something about this? Because the difference from the 1970s is that we know how to do it. We can solve this problem. The solutions are there, but we're not doing it.
Thank you.
Perhaps I can take us back from the 1970s as well. Sorry, move this closer. Sorry. I'm going to take us back from the 1970s. The Walker Institute is very much about interdisciplinary research in practice. Livelihood systems sit up at the front of our thinking as much as the climate science analysis that we do. And if we don't bring the two together, we really don't understand the system that we're trying to address the challenges for. So interdisciplinarity is part of my DNA. And my own personal hero is Alexander von Humboldt. And I'm going to take us back to those late 1800s, 1800s, when Alexander was out, a consummate leading German polymath at the time. He was out exploring South America. And in his explorations of Venezuela, he was down by Lake Valencia, and he listened to the local people talking about changing lake levels in Lake Valencia. And he hypothesized, and then as a scientist took meticulous measurements, but he understood that the felling of the trees, the deforestation around Lake Valencia, was contributing to changing lake levels and changing microclimates, which meant that soils were eroding and the people living around Lake Valencia were having to move and also change their agricultural and management practices. This was in 1800. He writes, by felling the trees that cover the tops and sides of the mountains, men in every climate prepare at once two calamities for future generations, the want of fuel and scarcity of water. And it is this relationship with our environment that we have become disconnected from, which forces us to drill, baby, drill instead, and put profits in front of what is absolutely the boiling frogs at this moment and causing the crisis. So back in 1800, Alexander von Humboldt actually went on then to come up with the concept of nature itself, and recognized through his measurements that he could, through isotherms and understanding changing ecology at different climates, different locations where people lived, that we were connected through isotherms, for example. And so we needed to understand each other, but also we could learn from other areas of the world that might be connected in that same ecology. So I think we need to think back to that 1800 point when Alexander von Humboldt said that we are part of this world that we live in, that could be, and he quotes destructive part of that world and recognise that link to climate change.
Well, thanks. I would agree with both points. I'll follow up with your drill, baby, drill reference with another term from the new US administration, Ordos Amoris, I believe, is what J.D. Vance is invoking. He's citing Catholic theology to justify kind of what you were saying, Brian, about attempt to morally justify that one's priority ought to be perhaps first to themselves, and then to their family, and then to their community, maybe then to their country, and only then afterwards to people outside. And you might have also seen Pope Francis's retort to that, and he wrote to the Catholic Bishops' Conference in the US with a list of different takes on Catholic theology, which opposes that. One thing which the Archbishop of Glasgow, who we work closely with as SCIAF, Archbishop Nolan often says is that people often tell him, oh, charity starts at home. And he says, yes, it does. Our common home, which is the planet Earth. And he really tries to put across an idea that we are indeed called, and the work of Caritas is an example of this, but we are called and challenged to genuinely regard people in faraway countries, people like Sophia, who I talked about before, as our brothers and sisters, and to show the same amount of love to our brothers and sisters here in this country as we would to those overseas. And that is a challenge, but surely the message of Christ and the message of Pope Francis and the theology of our church is meant to be challenging and morally challenging. And actually, I would suggest that the concept of Ordos Amoris and how it's been put across by J.D. Vance doesn't actually feel very challenging at all. It actually, by contrast, feels to be quite a instinctive, you might say, moral take on behaviour, and the radical teachings of Christ are that we should put aside maybe what would immediately come, you would say, naturally to you, but to do the right thing, which might be harder, but is what has been suggested we ought to do. But just moving on from that, I mean, I think I would say that in response to the question that we do often hear, or I often hear, attitudes amongst people, amongst citizens, non-experts on this subject, that they believe that the human nature is at fault for the climate crisis, that it's human nature to be self-interested and to be self-serving, to want to make as much profit, to want to consume as much as you possibly might want to. And I genuinely don't believe that, and I do try to push back against that. I think if there is a human tendency in contemporary society for people to genuinely want to overconsume or want to pursue personal profits at all costs, then that is the product of the economy in which we live in, and that has been perpetuated by the economic system in which we live. It serves our contemporary capitalist consumer economy for people to have that kind of attitude. But I retain hope that actually can change over time. And the reason to be hopeful, I suppose, is, like you referenced, Brian, and you as well, Roz, I think it's that we see human behaviour in communities often resisting that. Communities serving each other, communities looking after the poorest member of your community. We've seen in recent years, I mean, I see it in my local area, more and more people going out and picking up litter than they ever would before. We do see people recycling, even though we don't get paid to recycle in this country. People choose to do that. We saw during the COVID pandemic, people really caring for each other and putting other people ahead of yourself. We all know people in our individual life who would put other people first beyond all of their own personal needs. So I think we can take some hope from these aspects of human behaviour, which we experience every day.
Can I just add one more thing too? Some 20 years ago, I think a well-known climate scientist went to talk to the evangelical community in the US, and he found two views that came through. One was God put us here for stewardship of the planet, and that's our responsibility. But the other one was, we are here to exploit whatever God has put on this planet. So there can be a religious framework that says exploiting, if oil has been put under the ground here, that's for us to use. And God will have thought of all the things that happen beyond. So I just thought I'd add that as well.
And just to, if I may, just on, I mean, so this is exactly, and I suppose the message of Laudato Si is to try to counter that narrative, you know, that we are part of nature, intimately connected with nature. The idea of integral ecology put forward in the text is essentially a theology of sustainable development, which would no longer have that kind of view that human beings are somehow separate, that the social crisis that we face today as a species is intimately connected with the nature crisis, and we must hear the cry of the poor as well as the cry of the earth, and you can't do one without the other. There's a quote which I'll maybe just reference now, or do you want to come on to that later?
Well, it's okay. Since that's on that, I wondered if you wanted to. So since we've mentioned that now, I wondered if you want to just. You mentioned the integral ecology. I wondered if you wanted to just deepen that a bit about what you mean by integral ecology.
Yeah, no, thanks for the heads up yesterday that you would ask a definition on it. So I was thinking about it last night. I mean, it's a hard thing. I studied sustainable development as a master's program in sustainable development about 10, 15 years ago now. And there were two models which we were shown at that point. One was of a perfect Venn diagram, if you can imagine, the three circles of society, economy, and environment. And then we were shown another model which would have the big circle on the outside was the environment. On the inside, you might have society, and then on the inside that you'd have economy. And essentially, integral ecology combines both of these models, I would say, and is essentially an extension of, some of you might be aware of the Gaia hypothesis, that when we finally went and photographed the Earth, we were able to see the Earth as a very small thing, but also as one complex interconnected organism. And I would suggest that integral ecology kind of combines those two Venn diagrams, the concept of Gaia, but also crucially the social, moral and political elements of society. That we need to, when we are analysing the ecological breakdown or the environment at all, we need to, the only way we could get an adequate understanding of that is understanding how humans interact with it, and understanding how humans interact with the environment is a profoundly moral and as well as a social question. It's not a very succinct answer at all, but hopefully you get roughly. And that's
why I interrupted you in the quote, which I thought was to do with this.
The quote's interesting, and it's quite funny, really, because it's one of these ones. I found it online next to a picture of Pope Francis, attributing Pope Francis to it. But I've subsequently learned that it wasn't actually Pope Francis who said this. but the quote, nevertheless, is something that he would say, I think, and it's that rivers do not drink their own water, trees do not eat their own fruit. Living for others is a rule of nature. I actually don't know who's the original author of that quote. But the point to me is very clear that, and it relates deeply to a whole body of Catholic social thought about giving to others with abundance, like God gives to all of us with abundance. But also crucially that nature is not just something that we need to look after because it's right for us to look after it. Nature is not just something that we should look after because it's good for us to look after nature, but also that there are profound moral lessons within nature that we as a society can benefit from.
Did you want to pick up on something on that?
No, I'm quite.
Perhaps I'll, yes, I mean, I think this relationship between humans, animals, and the rest of the environment is one can put in very different ways. And you mentioned Gaia. The Gaia view is very much of the Earth system. And the Earth was doing quite well as a system till we disturbed it. So we've exploited all these fossil fuels, we've changed the atmosphere, we've changed it on the timescale, a human timescale of one generation. And the Gaia solution really is that the human species just eliminates itself. And the challenge for us is, can we envisage a future of this Earth with humans as part of it? So this isn't just something that's nice to talk about. This is an existential crisis for our species. Can we live on this Earth as part of it? And that really means part of it, not viewing ourselves as dominating everything.
Or a destructive part of it, as Alexander von Humboldt noted. I will come back actually to the nature and that integral part, because Ben, you just talked about Venn diagrams, and I see us all quite disconnected from the environments that we live in, the nature that surrounds us. And I was reminded of that, not just last night actually. I was out, this is me not talking as a scientist, but as a human being. I was out last night meeting up with my son who lives here, and I walked down up to Little Clarendon Street, and I live in Cornwall typically, so, you know, sort of quiet, cold, you know, fresh sea air, that sort of thing. And the streets were abuzz. You know, there were groups of people behind me singing loudly, and there were lights everywhere, and just restaurants and cafes. I was going, gosh, wonderful Oxford. and I didn't look up, and I was just walking through these buildings, and I went for dinner, and then I came back from dinner, and there was this silence around Oxford, and the sunset had concluded, and night stars were shining, and the shadows completely and the lights just changed, and suddenly I became very aware of the buildings around me, the shapes, the windows, the layers of glass, the different sculptures, the statues. I noticed the stars in the skies as I walked around, and I just thought, gosh, that change of aspect, that change of light has drawn my attention away from the buzz of humanity engaging with each other, and brought me back to understand the environment that I'm actually walking in and seeing. And that made me think of this, the climate crisis, and how we need to reconnect. We need a different view, shine a different light to see what we are in. And I just, it just made me also come back to where we are with Trump at the, you know, the American administration at the moment, because actually it's caused huge problems in terms of climate, because, for example, data sets that were available are suddenly not available. And looking at livelihoods data, for example, FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning System network, which Africa completely depended on, has been removed. There's no data there now. And it shone a light, it's shining a light for me on actually where things have actually not been managed the right way. It brings into mind colonialism, actually, the global north, big donors coming in, generating, creating, taking data, putting it into big international portals, but not making sure that it's sustained and able to be accessed, and you know, that the countries themselves, the people live in those countries, the structures need to change, the way we manage our data needs to change. So it shone a light for me on actually the crisis that we have, and I hope a change that could be made in how infrastructure, and for us as a scientist, that data collection, how it could be disaggregated and actually sustained properly and managed within the communities and the countries where it needs to be. All from a walk in Oxford last night.
Thank you.
Could I just say a few words about the structures we've set up, which really make this so difficult to tackle? I mean, I've always hoped that the oil companies would themselves move to being the developers of the new technologies. They have the money to do it, and our move in energy from fossil fuel to the green ways of generating energy. But we've seen that companies like BP, Shell, the stock market price dominates what happens to them. And this is all short time scale. The value of their stock depends on what is under the ground there that they have in their assets. And they start to move, but then the short-termism of the stock market means that they move back again. And we've seen in the economy, what does development mean? Does it mean GDP, or does it mean human well-being? And all the time we go back to these wrong measures of what we should be doing. But it's embedded in the system and very difficult to break through.
Thank you. So I think this now, I mean, this is, we've seen in what you've all said, this disconnectedness and this need for another way of looking at the way we stay together on this earth. So thinking about this, about how we move forward, looking more precisely at how we move forward to build solutions. What changes do you think we need in our culture and society, really at a human level, to be able to face the climate crisis collectively and to communicate this effectively? And how can we move from this being isolated and being alone to awareness of being together on one planet? And maybe if you can touch also on whether, is this idea of an integral ecology or the Gaia hypothesis, how that fits into that, or is there some other way of how we move to this idea of being together? Ross?
Sorry, just going to jump back in on that one. Just because it reminded me of actually something I meant to carry on saying about the Venn diagram. Alexander painted, back to him. He painted in 1802 Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador. He didn't need Venn diagrams. It was a painting of the mountain, the different ecosystems, the plants at different levels, people living and how they're engaging around and what their occupations were in the foothills of the mountains. And showing that interconnectivity between people and the environment and the interaction of that connectivity. And he was convinced that in order to enable people to think about nature, which is the concept that he put out into the world in the 1800s, nature, he was convinced that not only those meticulous measurements and understanding of science and the monitoring, the kind of things that we do now was needed, but also we needed an emotional, visceral response to reconnect and understand our own part to play in the environment that we live in. He talked about the Naturgemälde, the painting of nature, and poetry. I'm thinking about the wonderful poems that we heard, poems that keep my heart from failing, and things that live in plain sight, using poetry, art, as well as the science, that systems approach to help us to reconnect and understand the importance that every action that we take here in the global north has a reaction in the global south. You're a bit tired one day, you think, actually, do you know what? Let's just put that recycling in the black bin, right? Just to faff around and sort it all out this week. Let's just not go do that. But every time we don't do that small action, it does have a reaction for people who are vulnerable and living through recurring crisis and reaching the ends of their ability to move forwards and live and thrive and survive. Recurrent crises that end up with livelihoods assets which are critical, like the cattle being sold because they've had a drought, there's been a locust infestation, there's been another drought, there's been a flood, there's been COVID, there's another drought, and they're now selling their assets, they cannot survive. So enabling us to reconnect and understand where we as individuals can actually have impact and understand that we are part of nature and connected using everything that we have. Companionship, art, poetry, all together with science, remembering Naturgemälde.
Thanks. Yeah, I can follow on. There's a really interesting kind of debate about this often within the climate movement. And I remember it particularly around plastic straws when bans on plastic straws became very prominent a few years ago. And some people within the climate movement thinking, it's a waste of time, plastic straws, what difference does that really make? What we need is an end to fossil fuels, and that's our priority. Plastic straws is a distraction from the real action. That's the view that some people took. Whereas other people would embrace that as a symbolic action, a small action which people can do, which might make them at least feel a little bit more that they were making some sort of contribution towards this thing, which can feel very alien and very far away. And honestly, I don't really know where I sit on that question, because I think sometimes we do, in answer to this question about how we're going to get change, I think we need politics in order to get change. In order for the politics to move, we need the voters to move. And in order to get there, I think what I would be advocating for if I was going and meeting, party strategists within the UK would be that we need a more aspirational kind of take on the climate crisis instead of doom and gloom. It needs to be about green jobs and the new futures, cleaner air. People want cleaner air, healthier societies, and new jobs for the future. So to try and get people really excited about net zero rather than afraid of it. And I think that's probably the only route towards really protecting those targets within this country. I think there is a really dangerous association between the right, and especially the far right, and climate denialism, which needn't actually exist, really, because there's a lot of pretty strong right-wing arguments as well about action on climate change, which is that it can be very good for business and good for society in the long term. But on the other side of the more political arguments, I want to think about the personal transformation. And I think when I think about that, what I would suggest is that, with the transformation of the heart, which is what Pope Francis really calls for in Laudato Si, is something which we will need to see as well, and can be supported through policy, through education, or through other actions. And with that, I think that's when I would think more about what policy actions can be taken to support young people's engagement with nature. I think to really celebrate community and communal living, what policies can we do to do that? And a more moral question, and I was reflecting on this yesterday, is it seems to me that gluttony is not a sin anymore. It's not really seen as a sin anymore. You grow up in the UK, like how many young people, how many children would really think that overconsumption is a morally wrong thing to do? They might think it's bad because they're going to get fat, or they might think it's bad because they're going to spend a lot of money on it. But I think very few young people growing up would see gluttony as something which is fundamentally wrong. And that is a real fundamental problem that we've got here when it comes to tackling the climate crisis.
Yes, so the hopes for the future. I think we've seen that threat does not work, and the threat of a crisis really doesn't work on its own. That doesn't motivate people. They just think, well, I can manage, or I can cope, or I just want to keep living as I am. So the idea of the opportunity of this new world is certainly very important. And as part of that, in audiences, when I talk about climate change, I think I start with the individual. They say, what can we do? Well, the number one thing is use your voice. And that's your voice with your family, with your neighbours, and it's with your community. And it's when you vote, it's with your MP. And it's if everyone who thought this issue was so important actually used their voice in all the ways, that would carry through. And I think that's just got to be heard at Westminster, wherever, and in different countries. Use our voice to say this is so important. This is actually, it is a better life we're talking about, and actually it is people who are struggling now. This will help. It's job opportunities, but it's actually a better life if we're not all choking with that air. I think on the Today program years ago, I said, wouldn't it be nice if we actually went down the road and we weren't fighting with all these cars and coffee and whatever, and people were actually walking and cycling, and this is so much nicer. It's together, not isolated in your car where the world is out there and you're in your car. Somehow we've got to get this idea across that it's so much better if we're actually living together in this new way, and use your voice to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it is just the fact that a greener world is a healthier world for all of us, a happier, healthier future. So it just makes good sense to take these actions. And yes, policy action has to happen, and we spend our time, just going back to work, we are very much about interdisciplinary research that enables policy action. Unusually, probably, in many of the academic communities, we are making policy changes that impact, particularly in conflict-affected places. There is different, but policies to change policies actually need us to also use our voice to persuade those politicians that this is a policy change that must happen because of the short-termism that prevails. So using our voice, using our vote, being aware of the banks we use, for example. What are the green banks? Where are they investing? Where should we move to? If are they investing largely in fossil fuel companies? Being aware and finding information and sharing that information that you learn with your communities, with your colleagues, and with your families.
Thank you. So, since at the time, I don't know whether now's the right time. If we would like to, we could carry on, but I think if there are any questions from the floor, I would like to open it up. There is one at the back there. Do you want to use do we have a microphone? You wait for the microphone because we're also recording.
Hi, thank you very much for all of your very different perspectives on this issue. It's interesting to hear it more from the societal sort of standpoints. I was wondering what kind of policies you think could work in the UK particularly, and if there are any other countries that have already implemented policies that you think could work well here or that could set an example for some way that the UK could affect things on the global stage.
That's right.
Yes.
Well, we do have the Climate Change Act in the UK, which is something I was incredibly proud of. I'm not always proud of what we do, but the Climate Change Act in 2008 was quite something, and that's now committed us to going to net zero by 2050. And when it went through Parliament, it actually had 453 people voting for it and 5 against, I think. So you don't often get that. And we have the policies to go in that direction, but always there's this stuttering. You go up and you think we're doing it, and then we come back again. And we are going in the right direction, but not with enthusiasm. We should embrace it more, and not when suddenly it looks a bit cloudy, we start to pull back on it. There's an opportunity. We are only 1 or 2% of the world emissions, but the example people can give locally or as a country is extremely important, that we take this seriously enough that we're actually doing it and that we see the economic opportunity in doing it as well. So I think that's something we're doing quite well, but whether we're helping, we're not doing it with quite the enthusiasm we ought to, and whether we're helping others around the world cope with this problem, I really not very, and I'll hand over to Ros to say we're not.
We are in different ways. I mean, we are, the work of the UK scientists coming from a different perspective mean that we are actually helping to change and intervene on very specific policies, and they can be very, very locally specific. So, for example, we've intervened on environmental management in Uganda to make sure that the right components are brought into that bill. That's a very direct one. We've also intervened on budgets that have been enabled for extension services at a sub-national level to enable people to have more money in their hands to adapt in the way that they want to adapt in the communities that they're living. But on a global scale, we supported and actively are working on the COP28 declaration on peace, recovery, conflict and climate, and have taken that into action on transboundary risk management, again, using the kind of work that we're doing to support those global treaties. And again, indeed, on global health. One Health is so important, that link between the climate, the environment and public health, and supporting work on neglected tropical diseases and the current the Kigali Declaration. So UK policies, yes, we have, Brian's has rightly pointed to, but we are, even if they're not direct links, we are also taking the kind of work that we do and really trying to make sure that we bring in the evidence and enable the action, and we are having impact in that regard.
Just briefly, I'll come back with an example from Scotland. The Scottish Government just recently passed a Circular Economy Act, and the Act doesn't have much detail, but that means that the government are now producing a circular economy strategy, which should be published, I suppose, this year, if not next year. And if you're familiar with the concept of the circular economy, I mean, this is the idea that the way that so much consumption in our current economy runs is very inefficient, and you buy a good and you throw away the good, and you might have a lot of the valuable materials in that good then essentially lost to the economy. So with a circular economy model, you can make sure to bring that back in more, and that strategy should include things like, you know, support for more reuse and recycling services, maybe subsidies to help businesses, local small town businesses who repair things again in a way that you don't see that so much anymore, you know, washing machine repair businesses or clothing repair businesses, support for things like that. It could include restrictions on procurement for big businesses to make sure that they are indeed using a circular economy model when it comes to their procurement of lighting services or indeed recycling services within their buildings, or it could encompass further legal restrictions potentially in future, again, to try and embed that circular economy thing. We've seen some policies like that from the EU in recent years as well. I mean, I know iPhones and I think other bits of technology have increasingly had to change how they're produced because of EU regulations to make sure that they were at least able to be repaired and batteries able to be replaced, and that the chargers are now universal, things like that. I think we're going to need to see many more policies like that across the whole world to combat the consumption problem.
Yeah, Maria, and then so the one there first, and then Heather, forward, yes. Thank you, but that's it.
Hi, thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion. But do you think, based on your experience, that the global change is actually possible? Because we have been speaking about a lot of small things that everyone can do, and I've already been doing them for 15 years because I now work in sustainability, and before I was in Unilever that has always, been a sustainable company. Then I don't know if they really are, but I've been exposed to these topics for a number of years. But when you think about China and India and the US and all the big countries that are not going into this direction and they're not signing up to the COP or all the other big climate agreement, then you think even if the UK is going to go net zero by 2050, and even if all the European Union is going to do something, this is not going to make a difference to the world problem. So I don't know, I'm a bit skeptical about the overall solution.
Can I take up the China point? I've had quite a lot of contact with China over the years, and China is changing quite rapidly, and it's not changing at a speed which would damage its own economy, but it is changing pretty rapidly. And I've always thought, well, the problem we really should be confronting with China is that they're going to be in charge of all the technologies that we need. It's not their emissions that's a real problem. It's the fact we're allowing them to be leaders in all the technologies. They're changing quite rapidly. India hasn't really picked up with at speed yet, but it's moving away from coal a little compared to where it was. And of course, we have to allow that development will occur and at a speed which allows them to go to the new technologies. And the US, there's no doubt a lot will happen in the US, whatever is happening in Washington. So it's not good, but it's not as bad as it seems.
I mean, just briefly, or do we have time? No, to say on that, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that in the UNFCCC or in the Paris Agreement, or maybe in both, there is enshrined or at least reference to the rights to development from the poorest countries. Because when every country came together to agree to the convention, the Global South, could see quite clearly the injustice of the fact that the Global North had become rich and fat as a result of fossil fuel consumption, and that it was somehow not being allowed by them. And so therefore, actually action in Britain from the likes of Britain and the EU is essential to keeping the delicate global agreement together. Because if the EU and the UK were to shrug their shoulders and saying we're not going to do it, then I think the likes of China and India and the rest of the global south would be further emboldened to therefore not do it either, and to just continue exploiting fossil fuel as much as possible, and then you get a race to the bottom. So actually we need the UK and the EU and others like them even more so now, because the US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, to double down and to step up and to be leaders, because that's the only way that the global agreement is going to continue or possibly be a success.
Thank you. Really, question this lady here. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just have been thinking, I wonder whether you agree, whether the emphasis that Western culture puts on individual autonomy and independence has been extrapolated, regarding this disconnectedness with the rest of the world. I'm speaking very generally. And I also wonder whether, climate science, which, is accurate, and it's clear what it shows, but is it because politically the parties and the people who speak about and advocate for climate science and what's happening tend to be on the left or on the progressives, and some of the policies that those parties advocate may be distasteful to people on the right, and then you have the right on the whole discrediting climate science, and then they have other policies that people might like about them. If we could have something a bit more moderate in the middle that encompass both, maybe that's the way forward. Otherwise we just have this polarization going on and on.
I agree, the polarization is really most unhelpful. It's interesting that if you want to find perhaps the best political speech on climate change, you go back to 1990 and Margaret Thatcher at the UN. Fantastic speech. And she's not exactly a left-winger. And she took on the problem and really exposed it in a way that I don't think I've heard a politician since. And our UK Climate Change Act did go through Parliament with hardly anyone against it. Now, have been the lukewarmers, it's there, but we can manage it. And so rather than saying it doesn't exist, that's the sort of coping now. And that will get them through for a while. But it certainly is not helpful if it's right versus left. This has to be, it's a problem we have. We created it without knowing it, but we've known it for the last 30 years of what we've been doing. And we now have the ways of tackling it. If I can just raise this, what concerns me most, I think, is that a solution, quotes, may be found where we use solar radiation management. And that's to interfere, to send particles into the upper atmosphere to stop the sun's radiation coming through and therefore balance the heat budget of the Earth. But the climate would change hugely. It could be done by one company, such as Elon Musk's company. They could do it. As soon as you stopped, the Earth would return hugely suddenly to this imbalanced state. So it's not a solution. But it's something that may be tackled. And I think it makes it so urgent that we tackle this problem the right way, both right and left, those who have more emphasis on individual and those who have more emphasis on the society. It's a problem we've all got to tackle together. And it's so urgent because I fear that alternative, quotes, solution may be raised. Sorry, that's introducing something different. I noticed.
I don't know whether we've got. Yes, we need to. Yes, I think we're going to have to. Maybe one a very quick question, but we're going to have to. Ryan has to get trained in 5 minutes. If you.
Sure,
Yes.
it's a quick one. Thank you very much for the talk. There's often quite a strong anti-human element to the climate movement. Or I suppose, firstly, do you agree that exists, and B, how should that be dealt with?
Anti-human.
Thank God for you.
Can you explain?
Sorry, must I clarify?
Yes.
So we are the problem, you're saying?
Yes, that is often the attitude.
And there's no doubt we are the problem, but we could solve that problem. And I don't think it's helpful. I mean, I gave the guy a solution, which is that we exterminate ourselves. And if you like, that's a rather extreme version of what the Green Movement might be saying. And I think that sort of is one way of looking at the problem. But rather than saying, okay, we are the problem, we have to get back, as has been said before, to seeing ourselves as part of this whole interacting planet. And so it doesn't help to just knock us on the head. That won't do it. We have to change our perspective. So if the Green Movement's saying that, then it has let's get back to our perspective on life on this planet.
And just to say, I mean, if you're referring to perhaps, I mean, arguments about overpopulation, I think we hear quite a lot. And the retort to that most, and certainly my part of the Green Movement, would be that it's overconsumption that we need to look at, and we need to look at the consumption per head of capita rather than overpopulation. But also, yeah, you're right, and it took me a moment to think about what you were getting at, but you do hear, and I have heard quite a lot of people saying, for example, the biggest contribution you can make to your carbon footprint is having a child, and therefore just don't have a child. And I would say that arguments like that, honestly, in my experience within, the COP or within the climate movement, are very unusual. It's very rare that I would find that within people working within within the campaigns and within governance. Although I have heard it from certain commentators from time to time, and I agree with you that it's definitely highly problematic and not the solution.
I'm sorry, we do need to finish because Brian has a train to catch. So no, I'd just like to, but Ross and Ben will be around at least for the rest of the morning so we can chat. I'd just like to sum up just a couple of really points that really struck me. Very wide-ranging discussion. But these points about that Brian has just touched on now, but he said at the start, can we think together as human beings, as a species? And this is the challenge. Can we get back, you've just said, to being part of this, thinking of ourselves as being part of an interacting planet, that we're not just on our own, we're together as a planet, as a human species, interacting with the environment. And Ben introduced this idea which is the idea of this integral ecology that also Pope Francis spoke about, that we're not just on our own, it's not just the Gaia hypothesis, but human beings with our social, moral and political elements. And therefore you said a transformation of the heart is needed. And therefore, one first step, I think also in what Ross said, about this need to reconnect, to shine a different light, to see where we are, to become aware of our environment, to become aware of where we are. And I was very struck when you said about using poetry and art and things, etc. That everything is the possibility to become aware of who we are in this planet. And I think the rest of this weekend and all the other things that we're talking about this weekend on companionship and solitude are really this possibility to become aware of what it means that we're companions together on this planet as a first step in the solution. So I'd like to thank first of all the rest of the team who helped organise this panel with me. So Aquila Fanzoni, Roger Sylvester, and Borja Volante and Stefano Utile are in the panel, here in the audience. But I'd like to really give a deep thanks also to Ross, to Brian and Ben for giving their time and so much really intense and interesting discussion. I hope it's a discussion that we can carry on in some way. So thank you very much.